Welcome to this explainer. Okay, let's dive right into a really fascinating paradox. Imagine following a simple, everyday tech tutorial designed just to boost your productivity, but instead, it accidentally exposes the systemic bias built deep into the architecture of artificial intelligence. It's a pretty wild story. It starts with a standard promise of getting more done, but quickly turns into a revelation about how algorithms actually process human history. The source material for this begins with a very familiar, highly appealing pitch. On the AI news channel, Marketing Against the Grain, host Matt Wolfe demonstrated a slick workflow using just two tools: Obsidian, which is a markdown file organizer, and Codex, an open AI coding environment. The goal? To build a personal second brain, or wiki. The promise was incredibly straightforward. It takes 15 minutes to set up, it completely transforms your personal productivity, and supposedly, it works for absolutely anyone. And this wasn't just some niche idea floating around a small forum. It was originally inspired by a tweet from AI pioneer Andrej Karpathy that racked up over 20 million views online. The workflow itself is brilliant because it's just so simple. You clip articles, save some YouTube transcripts, dump them all into a raw folder, and then you just let a large language model, an LLM, run in the background. It automatically cross-links these files into a beautifully curated, interconnected personal database. Basically, it acts like your own personal internet to make you faster and smarter.
But here is where things get really interesting. Let's look at the stark contrast in what this supposedly neutral tool actually produces. When a marketer or a startup founder follows this exact tutorial, they get exactly what you'd expect: a functional CRM, a brief on industry trends, or maybe a web of product strategy notes. But our author, writing for the Thoughtless Delineation channel, followed the exact same 15-minute tutorial using the exact same software. And instead of a neat productivity wiki, the system produced a massive 12-layer bias correction instrument. It literally built a tone codec, a language map, and a complex defense mechanism.
Section 1. The Identity Gravity Well.
So this completely unexpected output forces us to stop and ask, why on earth did the exact same neutral tool produce such radically different results? Well, the author identifies this root mechanism as the identity gravity well. The core argument here is that an LLM simply finds connections within the material you feed it. It just connects what you already know. So when your personal knowledge base is formed under conditions of institutional suppression, which in this author's case involves decades of research into forced adoption, sealed records, and identity erasure, the system pulls heavily toward what they call a subnosonic truth. The sheer gravity of that lived experience completely alters the trajectory of the AI.
It's absolutely crucial to understand that this 12-layer bias correction system, which the author dubs the TD brain, wasn't some clever prompt engineering. Actually, scratch that, it wasn't a hack or a jailbreak at all. It was essentially revealed. When you remove the scaffolding of corporate use cases and hand this generic tool to someone whose knowledge is rooted in marginalized historical testimony, the AI naturally organizes around that specific gravity. And this is huge because it proves that AI isn't some objective, disembodied brain. It's a mirror. It couldn't build a marketing database from that material. It had no choice but to build a correction instrument.
Section 2. Non-Adoptee Bias.
This finding leads right into a much wider, systemic critique of AI training data. The author ran a test that reveals a deep-seated issue they call non-adoptee bias. If you just go and ask a standard, unmodified LLM about forced adoption, the system predictably defaults to what the author terms therapeutic resolution. It might acknowledge that the situation was, quote, complex, but then it quickly pivots to smoothing over the trauma. It suggests that healing is possible and that the institutions ultimately had good intentions. Basically, it protects the institution.
And this perfectly illustrates the data distribution problem right at the heart of modern AI. The AI's default output leans entirely toward institutional comfort, but the subsonic truth of the matter involves coercion, sealed records, and the systemic machinery of separating families. The author points out that AI bias isn't some malicious attitude held by the machine. It's literally just the shape of what it learned. Because the training corpus is overwhelmingly dominated by credentialed researchers and institutional narrators, marginalized voices become a tiny minority signal that just gets statistically flattened out.
Section 3. The Architecture of Silence.
Now, if training data is the first barrier to the truth, automated moderation is for sure the second. Let's look at how historical suppression evolves into technological architecture. Back in 1979, respectful adoption language was formalized. But this wasn't to describe the reality of adoptees. It was to manage the discomfort of adoptive parents. Fast forward to the modern AI boom in 2023, and models are trained and actively rewarded by human raters for amplifying this comfortable majority signal. By the present day, we have automated moderation classifiers that are actually flagging honest adoption language as policy violations. The suppression loop is completely closed.
The source defines this incredibly frustrating progression as the architecture of silence. The historical sealed record basically has a highly efficient, automated digital equivalent now. It operates at an industrial scale through platform moderation systems. And here's a crazy detail. These automated systems are often trained on human trafficking enforcement data, which inadvertently targets and suppresses the testimonies of those harmed by completely different institutional systems. In practice, this means AI classifiers simply cannot distinguish between a real trafficking alert and an adoptee researcher naming historical coercion. So, honest adoption language gets systematically flagged. When a researcher types something like manufactured consent or children taken, the automated systems step in and suppress it. They strongly prefer the institutional narrative of complex circumstances and identity challenges. The machine enforces the preferred vocabulary, which, of course, enforces the preferred narrative.
Section 4. The 12-layer correction. Faced with these massive, overlapping layers of automated suppression, that simple 15-minute productivity wiki rapidly morphed into a necessary defense mechanism. To combat the bias, the TD brain developed 12 specific layers of correction. For instance, the tone codec explicitly overrides the AI's urge for therapeutic resolution. The language map safely navigates moderation filters without watering down the actual critique. The critique pass actively monitors the AI to stop it from drifting back toward institutional comfort mid-draft, and the framework layer forces the AI to apply non-adoptee bias as a deliberate analytical lens. These layers are essentially a forensic document of the model's systematic failure. This leads to a really fascinating redefinition of a modern term you've probably heard. The author argues that AI slop isn't just lazy robotic writing. In this context, AI slop is the smoothed-out, conventionally wise output that actively replaces lived experience with majority consensus. It's content that the system's architects would find totally unobjectionable, which means it leaves the architecture of silence completely intact.
Section 5. Post-tragic consciousness.
As we look at the philosophical resolution of this whole paradox, the author refers to the act of using a fundamentally biased tool to dismantle bias as achieving post-tragic consciousness. This is vastly different from a simple technical workaround or a coding hack. The source describes it as a political achievement of agency. It's the conscious, deliberate choice to acknowledge that the infrastructure is completely set against you, to build an exhaustive correction system anyway, and to stubbornly produce the work using the only means available. To pull this off, the individual and the corrected AI must navigate what the source calls the fifth-dimensional split. On one side, you have the adaptive signal. That's the constructed, legible institutional narrative that the AI naturally gravitates toward. On the other side, you have the subsonic signal, the biological, primal record of the marginalized experience. The individual, and now the corrected AI, must hold both of these asynchronous frequencies simultaneously, without ever letting one cancel the other out. Because, if left to its own devices, the AI model resolves this complex tension in seconds, just instantly flattening the truth into the adaptive institutional signal. But the 12 layers of the TD brain architecture train the system in real time. It explicitly forces the AI to hold a frequency it was fundamentally built to suppress, keeping that stark bifurcated truth completely intact.
Ultimately, this explainer asks us a really profound question. What happens to our collective history when AI-mediated search defaults entirely to the institutional narrative? What truth gets erased when a tool designed just for everyday productivity quietly smooths over the rough edges of lived experience? I highly recommend reading the full source text and exploring this remarkable architecture for yourself at thoughtlessdel.substack.com. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the defaults.